Hi, I'm Dr. Randall Smith with Christian Travel Study Programs, and we've been exploring the lands of the Bible all over the Mediterranean world. Today we're on the beautiful Celebrity Reflection. What a vessel this is. I've been traveling the region of the Mediterranean. Here I am by the Aegean Sea on the island of Mykonos in Greece. But I've been traveling for 35 years, trying to expose and show people the context of the biblical narrative. For these last couple of decades, we've been making these videos site by site, trying to expose who was Jesus, who were the people that followed him, what happened as a result of the gospel message. And we are taking a look at the background of Paul's writings in places like Italy, in Malta, where he was bit by a snake, in Athens, in Corinth, and in some of the beautiful places like these islands that were all recipients of the early gospel message. Each one of our sites will be picked up in this series as we try to expose the background. And we're hoping that you will learn more and that the Bible will be more deeply meaningful to you. Even if you can't come on the tour, at least you can experience some of what we do as we make the journey together. Thanks for joining us in exploring the lands of the Bible. We've been taking a journey with some students to take a look at Corinth and the Corinthian Canal. We've been looking at the background of Paul's ministry. You know, Paul traveled a lot by ship. 4 times he was shipwrecked. We've been looking specifically at the Corinthian Canal, that cut that goes right through the Isthmus of Corinth. And then we went to visit Corinth, that city that's at the heart of the 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Paul's visit there in Acts 18. Join us as today we make our way to Greece and celebrate exploring the lands of the Bible. As we make our way to Corinth, I want to set the stage so that we can economize the time that we're at Corinth. Rather than tell you the whole story at Corinth, I'll set the stage for it now, okay? I want you to go back to the first mission journey, which was largely in Cyprus and what we would call today Turkey. And that first missionary journey is told about in Acts 13 and 14. Paul had to get back to Jerusalem in the year 50 for the Jerusalem Council. 14 years after he comes to Jesus and meets Jesus on the road to Damascus. He's already been to Arabia, he's already gone back to Tarsus, Barnabas has put him into service, and he's done the first missionary journey. And by the time we get to Acts 15, he is now representing how the Spirit of God has called Gentiles apart from making them Jews. Do you have to become a Jew to become a Christian? And they answer the question, no, but you do need to avoid the temples and the pagan temples. You need to avoid things strangled in blood. And you are going to walk according to the method of Jesus Christ. And so a letter is formed in Acts 15. And at the end of Acts 15, Acts 15:36 and following, this starts what we would call the second missionary journey. Here's the setting for you. Now, I'll build a little theme music in the background and we'll have some setting, okay? The whole second missionary journey is, in my view, the most disastrous time in Paul's ministry. Why? Well, it starts off with a fight, because that usually starts things really well. You know, did you ever start off in the morning with a fight with your spouse on your way to church? This is going to set the stage beautifully, because there'll be conflict. There is a certain amount of pressure that comes just from conflict. You remember that Paul has conflict with his first missionary journey partner, Barnabas. The issue of that conflict was a young fellow that Barnabas had brought along, John Mark, who had left when they were in southern, what today would be called Turkey. And he turned back. John Mark wasn't reliable. That's what Paul said. Barnabas said, John Mark is a work in progress and we're all about discipleship. That's what Barney said. The problem is Barney and Paul couldn't get themselves together. And it literally says, after a lot of disputing, they broke company. Now, Paul picks Silas and takes off. How many of you have ever been in a very strong, even theological conflict with some brother? You've been in a strong argument, let's say, with a brother. Long after the argument is over, the feeling remains. Remember, they say it's not what you say to me or what I say to you. It's how we leave each other, how we feel about each other when we part. So there's this tension in Paul's life. Imagine Paul and Silas, they make their way into southern Turkey, and as they come up to Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, and they get to Lystra, they pick up another young man. And now they have Timothy. At this point, this is just the beginning. Imagine Timothy started with you. The next thing that happens is Timothy is looking to you. Now you've circumcised Timothy. You've brought him along with you and Silas, and you're going to take him on the mission journeys, and you are going to go where? Well, the Spirit of God won't let you go in any of the directions you try to go. And so now there's a disorienting going on in the background of Paul's ministry. I have to believe that Timothy at some point was asking the question, hey, do you guys always have trouble figuring out where you're going next? But nevertheless, there's a dream of a Macedonian man that I suggested to you earlier was probably Luke. They'll make their way across to Neapolis and Philippi, and they'll put their feet on what is now in modern Greece. And they'll go to Philippi. What happens in Philippi? Well, initially, Lydia comes to Jesus, and she's a Thyatiran, or Thyatiran. But nevertheless, then there's a young girl with a Pythian spirit who keeps bothering Paul. Do you remember? And finally, after many days, he gets annoyed and says, that's enough. Casts out the demon, and the guy who owns the girl loses his cash crop. And now she's unable to do any of the things she could do with the Pythian spirit, and so Paul is taken with Silas. They're beaten. They're put in a retaining prison in Philippi. After they're set free from that, now Paul has gone through a personal argument. Now his body has been beaten. He'll get to Thessaloniki, and when he gets there, Jason, his cousin, will be locked up, and he'll have to leave there. He's gone from Philippi to Amphipolis, Apollonia, Thessaloniki. He'll make his way all the way over to Veria or Berea. And in Berea, he'll have a great ministry. And then the Thessalonian Jews will come and bother him there. And they will say, Silas and Timothy can stay, but you, Paul, must leave. Now, all that's just to get you to here. Probably nearby at a port like Theon, he sets sail to go to Athens. But he arrives in Athens. Now we're dealing with Acts 17 and 18. He arrives in Athens alone. When he comes into Athens, he gets stirred up. It's not that he falls in prayer. It's not that he seeks the Lord as to what to do. He walks through Athens and gets stirred up. This is the only time in his ministry where that is how it begins. Rather than using the scripture, he uses poetry. Relevant, but not necessarily scriptural. And he goes out there and preaches. A few come to Jesus. Dionysius, Damaris, some others. By the time he leaves Athens, he will make his way toward Corinth. Now we're coming to the end of 17, beginning of Acts 18. And by the time he gets to Corinth, he's pretty beat up. He's away from his team. He's been demoralized, drained, dried out. And honestly, things haven't gone all that well. Later on, when he writes 2 Corinthians, he said, when I came to you, I despaired even of my own life. Let's just put Paul at a point where he comes to Corinth and he's not excited. He's not. His passion has now been assailed by one struggle after another, beginning with a problem with another believer, with Barnabas, but following all the way through to personal beating, attacks on his family. Guys, if you've been in ministry very long, you know that the enemy never throws one punch. He throws repeated punches. And in Paul's life, by the time he comes to Corinth, he's been fairly well beaten down. I should tell you also that when we introduce Corinth, you will know that it's a difficult place for a kosher Jew to come and live. There's a reason they said it is not for every man to go to Corinth. It had a character that Vicky's going to explain to you. And that character was very uncomfortable for someone who's a kosher Jew, who grows up in Tarsus, in the third largest university town in the Greco-Roman world, and ends up in Jerusalem under Gamaliel and learning. Paul can't be at ease in Corinth. He's without his team, he's all alone, and he's just been laughed off the stage in Athens. So, what do we learn about renewing your passion? Our attempt to go to Corinth will be to do two things. One, we want to visit Corinth. We want to see what it was like, or at least some of what it was like, avoiding some of the statuary. Because if we were to actually revive all the statuary, there's no way I could stand there without blushing. Okay? We're going to set the stage. It's not so much to learn 1st and 2nd Corinthians, although we'll do a little bit of that. It's more the stage of Paul's critical moment. How do I renew my passion when my walk has been beat out of me? I want to ask an honest question. Have any of you gotten to the place at some point in your life and your walk where your passion was beat out of you? I'll raise my hand. There's two of us. The rest of you are lying. We know that. We'll deal with your sin later. But seriously, if you get to the point where you need renewed passion, then the message that's going to come from Corinth is the one for you. That will be from Acts 18. Okay? Vicky will be our guide here. All right, Vicky, here you go.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Since I'm a very short woman, almost a dwarf, I am carrying a red umbrella, and so you follow the umbrella. You know where Vicky is. Vicky's always under this red umbrella. This building to the right is a museum. They have these very nice Corinthian vases, ceramic vases. Back in the 70s, thieves broke in and stole a lot of things from this museum. There was no alarm, nothing. And some years ago, the FBI told Greek government that they found all this stored in a warehouse in Miami, Florida. And archaeologists were there with the Greek police, and together with the FBI, they got everything, and now they're back here in the museum. Okay, now let us walk this way, please. Okay, now we're gonna go this way towards the Temple of Apollo. You see the Temple of Apollo? And then we're turning right into the Forum Romanum, where Paul was tried. And Randy will take over. I'll tell you the first few things about ancient Corinth shortly, and then we hear about Paul. We have also stories since prehistoric times. And most of these stories belong to Greek mythology. Like, for example, the myth about Jason. Jason and the Argonauts went over, sailed up north, past the Dardanelles, and they went to the Black Sea, to a country called Ea, or Colchis. And there Jason met with this beautiful woman, a local woman, not Greek, by the name of Medea. And Medea helped him to take away the golden fleece. You know the story, yeah? Jason and the golden fleece. Then he married Medea, and they both came here. But Jason, who was not so faithful husband, You know, it happens often with Greek men, this thing. He decided to divorce his wife Medea. They had 2 sons together though, and to marry the young princess of Corinth by the name of Glaucus. He wanted to become a king here. He asked Medea to give him the divorce. She begged, she cried, no way. He was determined to get the divorce. Medea gave him the divorce, but since she was a witch, a sorceress, she decided to punish him and to kill his bride. One day before the wedding, she made a beautiful wedding gown dipped in a terrible poison and sent it as a gift to the bride. And the bride put it on her. She was poisoned, she was terribly suffering, and she threw herself inside this carved fountain. This was a fountain in front of us, this rock here, and water was running. Corinth was very rich in water. There were lots of springs here, and she died inside here. So that's how this fountain was named ever since, the Fountain of Glaucus, who was killed by Medea. And then Medea, you know what she did? She killed her own sons at the presence of her ex-husband Jason to punish him. In psychiatry, because psychiatry is a science that people who study psychiatry and psychology, they have to read Greek mythology and Greek tragedies. There are lots of syndromes based on these ancient Greek myths. The Medea syndrome, for example. Medea syndrome happening even now. Abandoned wives, abandoned husbands, girlfriends, boyfriends, kill their own children to punish the other one who left them. Doesn't it happen? All the time. And this is the Medea syndrome in psychiatry. Now, we leave this fountain, Glaucus fountain, on the left. There is no water any longer over here. And we are proceeding towards the temple of Apollo in front of us. You can see there were buildings all around here, public buildings, not houses. The houses were towards the water, down to the first harbor, Lehion, and just beyond the Acropolis, all the residential area of ancient Corinth. The population was quite high. There is a reference in Roman times that the population reached the number of 300,000 people. Well, this is exaggerating, of course, there couldn't be so many. And the number of slaves, almost as many as the citizens. They had thousands of slaves. Some of them owned 1,000 slaves or 2,000 slaves over here. So imagine that this whole area was covered up with dirt in the course of the centuries. And the little houses of old Corinth, the village, you see the village behind there? You see these houses with the red roofs? This village was extending and covering up this whole archaeological site at one time. So when the Americans came, they knew that under here should be the center of ancient Corinth. Reading Pausanias, the book, the writer I mentioned to you earlier on the bus. And since the temple of Apollo was always visible, the houses were all around the temple. They knew where to dig. They paid these people, they relocated them, they built for them new houses. You know, this whole, excavation activity was taking place before World War II and then in the 50s. And most of the money came from the Rockefeller Foundation in the United States. They paid for the digs here. So, what existed here? The Temple of Apollo. Notice please the columns. Look at the columns. They are quite different than what we see visiting the Parthenon. They're straight columns, and there is an element I have to point out to you, that these columns are not cut into pieces, what we call drums, but they are one piece of stone, limestone, okay? It's monolithic, we call them monolithic. So when we see monolithic columns in ancient temples, it means that the temple is very old, it's very primitive. And indeed, this temple was built in a very, very old period of time, the end of the 7th century BC. And inside there was a statue of Apollo. Apollo was predicting the future. They had a little oracle down below this temple. Of course, there were more temples around here. And then when the Romans came, they built their own temples, even dedicated to relatives of the emperors. Like there was a temple of Octavia here. Octavia was Octavian's sister. You see, the Romans wanted the people to worship them as gods, to be immortal. And Randy, correct me if I'm wrong, that the most dangerous accusation against the Christians, the early Christians of Roman Empire at that time, by the Jews, was that they didn't follow and respect the Roman law, because the Christians refused to worship the emperors, statues of emperors and other things, and this was the Roman law.
You remember that the first law that they were actually arrested for in maestas trials to the Romans were because of the dissolution of the orders.
Oh, yeah.
They had people of rank and standing, equestrians, in the same fellowship breaking bread with low plebs. You can't do that. There's a status for Romans. So the first law they broke was a law of the orders. The second law they broke, the Romans didn't care if you had your own gods. That's what she was saying. Vicky was making clear that you can have your own god, but kindly worship the emperor and kindly be patriotic enough to worship to the state gods as well, because they're the protectors around which our economy and our safety. So you're unpatriotic if you're a person who dares not to both venerate the august ones, the Augustus, and those that are deified, the Dewis after him. And you're also not really patriotic if you don't understand that there are state gods and they're important to us.
Were the Jews willing to do that, but the Christians weren't? Because, you know...
Okay, there were two groups of people that got a special condition given to them when they fell under, the Jews fell under Pompey Magnus. When Pompey the Great in 63 BC took the Jewish people, there was a special concession made to them. Every 7th year, they did not have to pay taxes because of a Jewish law and respect the Romans had for local laws, at least they said respect. And they had the right not to have at their national temple, at the temple in Jerusalem, a worship center for a pagan god or for the emperor. They were to do it, but not at that site. That was the condition.
That was the condition. And another thing that I read in a book, that I don't know if this is correct information, that the Jews would claim, well, we have our own God and we pray to our own God for your emperors.
For your emperors because of Jeremiah, right.
Enough for the Romans to agree with this, but the Christians wouldn't say that. I mean, they would never dare to mention your own God, who is a human being, he's an emperor. They would never do that. The Jews were more diplomatic in those days.
But they were constantly brought in trials. Philo of Alexandria was brought on trial on behalf of the Alexandrian Jews. Jews inside Israel had one arrangement. Jews outside of Israel often got into conflict, like in Alexandria, with their local community, because they tried to live according to Jewish law, but they weren't living inside Eretz Israel, inside the land of Israel. And that's where the legal problems came in. That's essentially what happens here as well.
Okay, let's now walk into the Forum Romanum, the center of the city of Corinth. So here there were a number of Roman temples. Well, I would like to very briefly to tell you how we passed from the Greek times to Roman times. What happened during Greek times, this glorious Greek period over here? I mentioned that the Corinthians were very rich people, that the Corinthians had a great trade, mercantile trade. They were making the best perfumes in the whole of the world, like French perfumes nowadays. The Corinthian perfume flasks have been found as far as Gibraltar, thousands of them, with this very delicate painting on them. They have been found around the coast of the Black Sea, meaning that they were selling their perfumes and other things as well. Gowns, sandals, whatever you can imagine. Excellent merchants. During the Persian Wars, when the Persians attacked Greece, they behaved in a very patriotic way because they contributed in these battles and they fought together with the other Greeks against the Persians. However, later we have the age of Alexander the Great. Well, I forgot to tell you, before Alexander the Great, the Corinthians fought on the side of the Spartans against Athens in the Peloponnesian War. One man, Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, was the first Greek king who managed to unite under his leadership the whole of Greece, because Greece was split in different powers, political powers around. Philip came here. He built a big hotel in the back there, and he invited delegates from all over the cities of Greece. And they came here, and Philip was elected by the whole of Greece as the leader against the war in Asia to punish the Persians. I mean, what Alexander did later, it was his father Philip's idea to do, but Philip was assassinated in his own old capital, and then Alexander took over, who also came here, and he was also chosen to be the leader of the Greeks, and we know what happened next. He made this big army, and he left, he went over to Asia Minor, and he defeated the Persians and abolished the Persian kingdom. In the Old Testament, in Daniel had a vision, and he's predicting what's going to happen to the Persians. Are you familiar with this chapter? And he mentions that the great king from Greece will abolish the Persian kingdom, and this king will die young, and he's not going to leave any heir, anybody to continue, to succeed him, and his whole empire is going to be split in the different sides of the universe.
In Daniel 11.
Yes, read about this chapter, and this is very important for our identity. Some people say Daniel was written after Alexander, and so they knew exactly what happened and they wrote down. That's what they say, a lot of skeptical authors. Yeah. So the Corinthians fought against the Persians. The Corinthians accepted the Greeks here, and Alexander the Great and Philip came here. Then in 147, the Romans destroyed Corinth. Momius, the general, everybody left, most of them were killed, and it was left deserted for 100 years until Julius Caesar decided to come back in 44 BC to rebuild the city here. He brought Roman veterans with him. He invited Greek people to come back here. They were resettled in the city, and the city was named, another name given, Colonia Julia Corinthiensis, the Julian colony of Corinth, flourishing again, becoming rich once again. Jewish people came, to make the long story short, and then we have the arrival of Paul, of course. So what we have, you know what, let's go and walk towards that other tree in the shade, where you can, we can hear these interesting things about Paul. Now, as we walk, I want to show you on the right-hand side there, in the very back, we have these Greek ruins, the Stoa, the colonnade, and the hotel, which Philip, the father of Alexander, built. This was an open-air space. This was the Forum, and the Romans had paved it. The Greeks never paved open-air spaces, but they left them beaten earth. But the Romans loved to pave up everything, and you can see some parts here of this Roman pavement. On the left-hand side, the 14 shops, rooms, one next to the other, and a colonnade in front of them. This means that these buildings were shops in antiquity, and there were shops here all the time, since ancient Greek times. Then when Corinth was conquered by the Romans, they rebuilt these shops. You can see the central one, which has been restored to show us the latest phase of these stores. It has a bed wall roof, one next to the other. They found remains of older Greek buildings. What I want to show you, if you walk towards where this lady is with the umbrella, a little further down, you will see a paved street that was very, very busy with shops on both sides. There was a fountain on one side, shops on the other side. And you know, between these shops, they have found those sockets where those tents were fixed. The tents which probably, Paul was making tents together with Aquila. That was his own art. And they were called Cilicium, from Cilicia, made of goat's hair. And when we say tents, we don't only mean the tents we know about, we mean these canopies, which were also dividing the shops one from another. And all the shops are down there towards the harbor, the Lehion harbor, and that street was only for pedestrians, not for wheel traffic. And down there was the entrance into the Forum Romanum with a very big gate. On the top of the gate was a bronze statue of God's Son, riding his chariot, having next to him his child, Phaethon. And it was so high that sailors approaching to the Lehion port could see the sculpture, that king, that sun god, from quite a distance from here. And just behind you, the monumental rostrum, that was the most official part of the forum, on the top of which the Roman proconsuls, the leaders, were announcing their decisions to the public. People were gathering here. They didn't have any television or newspapers, and the decisions were announced from the top of the rostrum. Bema is the Greek name of it, and this is where Paul was tried. And Randy will take over.
Guys, let's take a minute. First, Vicky's done a great job of building the town around you. So the oldest monument will be sticking up behind the shops. Then you'll have a row of shops, then you'll have an open plaza. If I walked over here, I would find the meat market of the town. One of the least impressive parts of the excavation of the American team is the scattering here on this part of the site. We didn't know exactly what they had come into when they found it, but because of Pompeii and the meat market that is found there, or the grocery market that was found there, we find today that this is the same size and shape as that is. And because in Pompeii it was buried with the signs on it, we know what it was for. So later on in our tour, we're going to take a look at a very nicely reconstructed one that was buried by Vesuvius in the Bay of Naples. Here, it was difficult to make any sense out of the ruins. But here's what's important about the ruins. The meat market here would be one of the central themes in 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, where Paul is finding himself having to talk about black and white principles for gray areas. Can I eat meat offered to idols? And it's set here, obviously, at the meat market. Okay, I'm inside of a macellum. I'm inside of essentially a food market. Because they were able to discern a series of stalls along the side of the macellum, and because there is some pictures frescoed over there, we know exactly what it was, we know what its purpose was. There's a tolos in the middle, a circular building, and here is where they found the fish scales. That's how we know what they are for in all the other macella of the world. We didn't know because we couldn't find them. Here we found them. Now, the people come to a market day from all of the small villages all around and come to the city and collect up and then transport out many of the goods that they take. So this is not just your local supermarket. The macellum is actually a center for commerce for people from the whole region. Small villages, small people that would come once a week maybe for market day. And this goes on all the way through the Middle Ages. You see it all over Europe. And in the market you have both a sacred area and the tolos in the center for the fish market, and around the edges various kinds of legume sales and things that you would buy. When we originally found these in excavations, we weren't sure what they were. It was because of Pompeii and the finding of the fish scales and remains that we know they were fish markets. In the other places, they were so there is such a place in Corinth, but there was nothing found there. So when we look at Pompeii, the reason we're describing all these other Roman cities is this is the best place. This and Ercolano are the best places where you can see how it worked when it was functioning. Then if I take you to Scythopolis in northern Israel and we dig up a room that's this shape with this kind of raised platform, we know what it is because of this one. So this is the prototypical place, okay? Now, here's what I want you to see. In many of these macellum setups, on the outside they used small triclinia, public three-sided reclining tables, where they would serve bargain meats that were offered to the idols on the inside. So this is the best place in the world, I can tell you, 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10. Because those chapters in 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10 were all about meat offered to idols. Now, most of you, that's not a relevant issue. So let's step one step further in our understanding of how to take the New Testament apart. What if I'm not a Roman? Can I apply their marriage laws to my life? Well, no, but you can apply the principles of the solution to your life. What if I'm not a Roman and meat offered to idols is really not an issue for me? which I'm going to wager nobody has an issue with. Nobody's been offended by Christians, with meat offered to idols. So what does this passage do? It gives me black and white principles for things that not all believers agree with. So let's set it up. If I have an altar, and from that altar, meat is being cut and carved and being sold at a discount in some of the shops, and served in some small banquet rooms just along the outside here, then can I buy it? Can I consume it at home? Can I eat it in a public banquet hall? This is exactly what he was dealing with. For our purposes, go back to 8, and it says, concerning the things sacrificed to idols. And you're probably wondering, what did they ask him about sacrifices to idols? And he says, we know there's no such thing as an idol in the world, that there's only one God. But not everybody has knowledge of this. And then he divides in chapters 8, 9, and 10 into 3 important distinctions. In chapter 8, he says, if you're in public, how do you handle a liberty like eating a meat offered to an idol? What do I do when I'm in front of other people? And this is what Paul says, I'm summarizing. He did nothing, not a thing, to change his practice for the purpose of a legalist. But he would do anything to stop a weaker brother from in any way stumbling because of what he did. Here's what's important. Who's a legalist? A legalist is a person who's not going to stumble but wants to control you. Their issue is control. So they say, well, I don't believe that's right, and you shouldn't do it either because I don't believe it's right. That's a legalist. They're a person who wants to run the room by being offended. And you are not to make your decisions based on, is anyone offended? Because you'll have somebody offended at virtually everything. And control people will use that as a controller. However, a person who might stumble, let's say you were at the local community, part of a local cultic community, because you would have been if you were part of the crafts. And let's say that in your local cultic community, it came about that you came to know Jesus. Now you're part of a little house church meeting in a villa on the second district. And that's where you go to church. And your Sunday school teacher there that has been teaching you about Jesus comes and buys the cheap meat and eats at the public triclinium. And that's the cult from which you came out of in order to come to Christ. If you see your leader, Sunday school teacher, local pastor, shepherd eating there, you're going to easily fall back into that cult. Remember, Acts 15 says you have to get away from those cultic places to be part of the people of the way, the early church. So if you're not sure, you might stumble. Okay, in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, he tells you very carefully, in public, what's the rule? I won't do it if it'll harm a brother and cause him to stumble, but I won't stop doing it just because somebody is trying to be a legalist. That's my line. Now, if in chapter 8 you were told, don't cancel what you're doing for a legalist, but always look out for a person who could stumble. In chapters 9 and 10, he divides it into 2 other parts. What about in private? Can I in private do something that I don't do in public? Is that hypocritical? Answer, no. We all have bedroom doors. There's a reason. Things done in private aren't necessarily for public consumption. And so yes, you follow what the standard of the Spirit of God gave you, and you don't worry about whether or not everybody's on board with that, but you don't talk about it. You don't blog about it. You don't have a picture of you doing it on Facebook, because that's going to cause the person who can stumble someplace where they're going to get rocked. What's the third one? It's the picnic. What if an unsaved person invites you, in chapter 10, to a picnic where the meat is offered to idols? Basically, Paul said this, don't ask. Why? Because there's always that believer who runs around trying to ruin my day by telling me that this is associated with somebody who shook hands with somebody who knew somebody who did something bad, and so I can't go there. Don't you know that corporation supports? And all of a sudden, everything I want to do gets taken away from me. What he says is, don't ask. Don't be a pain in the butt Christian. And then he says, but if someone comes up to you, a brother, and says, Sandy, Why are you eating that chicken? That chicken was sacrificed to an idol. Drop that chicken and go, that? I had no idea that that chicken was sacrificed to idols, and then swallow it. The point being, you don't make trouble, but you try to keep other people from crashing into the reefs. So this is the best place. Look how close the precinct of the altar is to the actual function of the Macellum. This is the place where cults bumped into the local economy of regular Romans. And that's why it's got 3 chapters in 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10. Okay? If I walk to the center, I'll find a raised platform. The raised platform, the bema of the city, which will be important to the story and important to the letters that Paul will write to the Corinthians. In the 140s BC, this city was destroyed at Corinth by General Mummius for the Romans. And for 100 years, it lay here in ruins until Julius Caesar decided he was going to put some money into it and revive the city. By the time Julius got around to it, he was, of course, killed. So Augustus is the one who actually pours a lot of workers into Corinth to rebuild it. When they rebuilt the area of the bema, or the top of the bema seat, is up here. Imagine this is a raised platform we saw from the other side. But you notice that the early Christians actually formed a small chapel here to remember the Acts 18 setting for Gallio, the proconsul, who was proconsul in 51 and 52. So there was a small chapel built up here. Archaeologically, beneath that chapel, they were preserving the flat platform upon which the proconsul would have placed his chair or his judgment seat. And of course, they're remembering this because of Paul being there. But it's also great imagery for 1 Corinthians 3 and 2 Corinthians 5 and the judgment seat of Christ. There's another fountain on the other side, main thoroughfares. And remember, the removal of various statuary that was reportedly here, according to historians. And the statuary represented many different forms of sexual acts, reminding people that Acrocorinth is up there, and it's your religious and civic responsibility to pay homage to the upper part of the city. I'm standing in front of what's called the South Stoa, but actually behind me is the mountain of Acrocorinth. When we talk about an acropolis, it means above the city. The cultic centers of these ancient cities were often built on platforms high up above, and here you can see Acrocorinth was built. Now this is a temple that's unlike other kinds of temples. Its major purpose probably was prostitution. Remember, to Corinthianize became a verb that meant to corrupt. In ancient Corinth, they didn't collect taxes in the city, but rather they had their taxation collected through those who were in the prostitution temples up above. The sexuality and sensuality is highly dramatic in Corinth, and as a result, you see in 1 Corinthians, for instance, in chapter 5, where people are acting sexually immorally, and the church is boasting about how it's so good and so embracing and so loving that it can overlook this kind of malady. And Paul says you need to set that person aside and get them out of the church. Later on, after a time when they repent, in 2 Corinthians, he will invite them back into the church because they've already repented of what they were doing. What's important to remember is that Corinth was a very, very tough environment. We have environments like, say, a Las Vegas Strip, where there's a certain kind of element there and a certain kind of morality that's difficult to handle outside. Well, Corinth was that in the Roman period. And that's why they said it was not for every man to come to Corinth. We know that there were 1,000 daughters of the city. Imagine wealthy people taking their daughters and placing them into the eterii, the prostitution work. And it wasn't a dishonorable thing, it was an honorable thing. This was the way you supported your polis, your city, Corinth. And so in some ways it was looked at reversed in terms of our own morality and ethics. Paul had to break ground on that in writing to the Corinthians. Remember that there are no taxes. During the Roman period, taxes are not raised in Corinth. The taxes are all taken from Acrocorinth. In other words, that's where the money changes over. Remember that in the Greek context, when you see temple, temple equals bank. It's a place where things flowed through the cultic divisions within society. Behind me is the temple that was built to Augustus's sister, Octavius. And it's a wonderful Roman temple, but actually just outside this temple and next to the museum that's alongside of it, were found a number of parts and pieces of bodies. They look like the statue bodies that were broken statues. We find out that the arms, the legs, the noses, the ears that were found, they weren't broken pieces of statue. There was an Asclepion in the city. This is a place where people could come for medical healing, and when they got healed, they would bring as part of their payment, let's say their arm was broken, they could bring an arm from a statue maker, and the doctors would hang it on their wall. Well, when they were first found here, there were found lots of pieces of these statuary, and nobody knew what they were for. Now we know in every place there's a healing center or an Asclepion, there are all these body parts that show up. They used to hang on the walls. So instead of an insurance statement and the degree from the medical school, what you had were body parts of people who had been healed before of their various maladies. Now, you're hearing a swirl of information. I want to pull you down for a minute. There is nothing that anthropologists or archaeologists can do to explain how it was that by the 8th century BC, there began such a rapid expansion in Attica and the area around Athens of people. We don't know why it happened, but coming out of the dark period and moving through an archaic and into the golden age of Greece, there was a dramatic rise in several things. Population was one. Now the populations, when archaeologists study the populations here, we tell it on a series of polises. A polis is a Greek idea. Aristotle said man is a political animal. He's meant for the items of a city. But the polis, like at Athens or at Corinth or at Sparta, was your chief identity as a Greek. You didn't see yourself as part of a larger union often. Most important to you was your personal status belonging to the polis or city you belonged to. So a Corinthian was a Corinthian. They probably saw themselves less organized around the Peloponnese or the areas of other cities. They saw themselves as a Corinthian, almost as a city-state. Now remember, Corinth goes through a very big transition. So at the end of its long Greek period, look, there is no accounting for how deep the grooves in our society came from the ancient Greeks. In architecture, in art, in language. Vicky's been telling us all these words. In language, you say many takeoffs of Greek words. So there's a deep philosophical. You don't watch any drama on television that isn't a remake of a Greek drama. They're all remakes of ancient dramas. And the great stories that we have today are largely told from there. Okay, I'm standing in the center of Corinth for a minute, and I want to put on myself the skin of a Corinthian. Half of everybody you see in the street is wearing a tunic. That means they're working, or if they're wearing a belt, it's also a slave. The larger upper classes are not out here in the midday, because why would you be out here in the midday? It's hot. But what we find is when Paul arrives, he's just come through a terrible time in his life. He got to Athens, but when he comes out of Athens, only a few people at the end of chapter 17 of the book of Acts have come to know Jesus. I set you up by telling you he has been beaten up, he has had his family attacked, he has had division in the ranks, and it's not going swimmingly well. Acts 18:1 says, after these things, and you should read it with weight, after these incredibly discouraging things, alone, he left and he went to Corinth. What's interesting is, in the story of chapter 18, there's a marvelous story of how to renew passion. What's the first thing God gave him? In verse 2, he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, or Prisca, because Claudius, the emperor, had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. This was the second command for Jews to leave Rome. One of them happened under Caligula, then another one under Claudius, and we know that was about the year 51. Here's what's important. He gets here, he's alone, his team is still tied up in Berea. He's not with anyone, he's come out of Athens, it didn't go well. He walks in and God first gives him a new friend. But not just a new friend that worked in the field where he worked. And not just a new co-worker, but someone who had the religious and ethnic background that he had. So he finds somebody that he can be a partner or a team member with, not because Aquila and Priscilla right then were prepared, but because there were enough connection points, so God gave him something really good. Can I just give you the first thing God did when Paul was hurt? He gave him time to withdraw. The second thing he did was he gave others to lock arms with and begin to strengthen himself. Then look at what happened next. Because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them. They were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And so you see it. Now he's got somebody to work with. He's got somebody to spend time with. It's hard for us to imagine that Paul could lose his footing. But after being discouraged, he's not ready to come into Athens and start a church. He doesn't run over to the synagogue first thing. First thing, he finds a partner and makes some tents. Sometimes the menial task is the thing that God can use to help bring you back. My mom used to say, whenever you're discouraged, go clean the garage. You may still be discouraged, but you'll have a clean garage. Okay? And the point is that sometimes the psychology of doing something, laying on the couch feeling bad about it, is not the right thing. Then it goes on. Then he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade both Jews and Greeks. So you have Jews of Jewish background and Greeks who are proselytes to Judaism, who are meeting in the synagogue. And it says that Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. At the first, he was making tents. And then he was doing a little teaching. Then he was making tents, but doing more teaching. Finally, he devoted himself to teaching. And it says, when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said, your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. Now I go to the Gentiles. Don't misunderstand that phrase. He said it in the first missionary journey too, and he'll say it later. He doesn't mean for the rest of my life I'm only going to talk to Gentiles. What he means is I fulfilled my obligation to the Jew first, and now I will walk to the Greeks and I will give to them. If you don't want this, be it known to you that you have rejected this message. I will walk into town and I will do what I can to reach those locals. He left there. And he went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, and with his household, and many Corinthians, when they heard, believed and were baptized. And Paul then got the next thing. So he's gotten time for a break. He's gotten new friends. Then there's a rough start, but he gets a reaction and starts to see people saved. This is called the new area of excavation. It's a little newer than the rest. And found inside this area of excavation, just down in there at the bottom, there's 4 poles that are kind of bluish around the little marker where it says Erastus is mentioned. He's the one who dedicated the pavement. Erastus is mentioned in Romans as one of the city officials. And so what we know is that Paul not only reached poor people, but he also reached some of the wealthier people. So 1 Corinthians tells us that there were individuals living in the town. Some of them were wealthier individuals and they were part of the local church. Erastus' name shows up both on a pavement here and in the New Testament, and that's what makes it exciting. There are very few things more encouraging to any pastor I know than seeing people's lives set free from sin. And now here he is, excited about that, and then comes the big one. Jesus comes. And in a red letter edition of the New Testament, this part's in red. It says, Paul saw that night a vision. And the Lord said to him, do not be afraid any longer. Now the any longer is italicized. It's an implication in the Greek. But it looks like Paul is suffering from fear. Now that is not the Paul we know. Because the Paul we know is the Teflon character that walks around like super evangelist. Nothing hits me. Throw your darts and spears. They all bounce. No. Jesus comes to him and says, go on speaking. Do not become silent. Paul literally got to the place where that incredible voice and those fingers that pen out 13 named epistles in the New Testament was almost silenced by discouragement. Do not mistake the strongest voices in Christianity for people who cannot become so discouraged they can barely go forward. And here it says, I am with you. The same thing he told Moses. What is the great prize? The prize for the Christian is not heaven. The prize for the Christian is the companion of the Savior, to walk through today, not just in the future. Yes, I will fall in his arms when I'm absent from this body, but today I can grab his hand. It says, I am with you. No one will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city. As a result, he settled there for 1 year and 6 months. It took Jesus breaking through and saying, stay here, do this. I know you've been beat up. I'm not going to let them hurt you. Now wait, just about that time, Gallio is the proconsul of Achaia. Gallio is the brother, perhaps, of Seneca, we believe, who was the tutor for Nero. And Gallio, in a 1908 inscription found in Delphi, we know that he was proconsul in the years 51-52, overlapping 51-52. So again, I would stop and remind you that the New Testament doesn't just float above the air. It has real touch points to history. We can know when Paul is here. So it says, some Jews rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. That's what we were talking about. It's okay to worship a God, but not contrary to the law by withdrawing from state gods. When Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if this is a matter of a wrong of a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if these are questions about words and names on your own law, look after it yourselves. I am unwilling to be judged in such matters. So from the bema of this town, Paul is dragged in here, but Paul has a promise. Guys, don't miss this. The revelation that Jesus gave him that I won't let someone harm you did not include no one will try. It was that no one will succeed. So Paul thinks he has to defend himself, but before he can speak, God provides the defense through Gallio's mouth. And he is able to walk away. It says, and he drove them away from the judgment seat, which is in the center of the town. And so they took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. He simply walks away. And Paul remains here many days. Now, what I would remind you is when Paul writes back to them, Paul will write in 1 Corinthians 3 and 2 Corinthians 5 about the bema seat of Christ. This is a different kind of judgment than a legal judgment. The bema seat is normally a judgment that goes along with games or performance so that you are awarded according to your performance. Every person has two judgments, one over sin and one over performance. We talked about that the other day. Now remember that all people have two judgments. Everybody, saved and lost, we all have two judgments. One of them is a judgment of sin. Yours, if you know Jesus, was done at the cross. But there's another judgment for you, and that's performance. That's the bema seat of Christ, 1 Corinthians 3, 2 Corinthians 5. But we all have two judgments. In the end of Revelation, the lost was their name found written in the book of life. In other words, was their sin paid for by Jesus or not? And then another book is brought out, the good and evil deeds of men, performance. All of us get that. The only difference is those of us who Jesus paid for our first punishment are already past that. I do not get judged for my sin, but my sin hinders my performance, and I will get judged on the basis of my performance. Sin and performance. In our case, it's called the bema seat of Christ, and we're going to see a bema when we are in Corinth, so you can grab onto what 1 Corinthians 3 and 2 Corinthians 5 is talking about. Standing next to the bema in Corinth, it reminds us of two events. One, when Gallio was sitting on top, judging between those who were trying to harm Paul in the city in Acts chapter 18. And the second event, I think that's every bit as important, perhaps even more important. This is the motif or the description of an event that will happen in my life and in yours. 1 Corinthians 3 and 2 Corinthians 5 teaches that we will all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, the bema seat. Bema is the word for raised place. Bema is a platform upon which you would put a seat of judgment. Not only was Gallio the proconsul there in Acts 18, but also This is the image Paul would have had in 1 Corinthians 3 and 2 Corinthians 5 in the mind of the Corinthian. Now, it's used in two ways. Sometimes it's a judgment seat for public judgment that is going on as a result of some kind of court case. But more often it's used at the end of games in order to give out laurels, kind of like the platforms that you stand on Olympic Games, and there are 3 levels for gold, silver, and bronze. Here, this is a place where athletes were given by their performance different laurels that became incredibly important for their life. Paul writes to the Corinthians and says that absent from the body, I'll be present with the Lord. But when I'm present with the Lord, I'm going to stand there and every one of us will be measured. Think about this. The seconds, the minutes, the hours, the weeks, the months of my life will be placed between the fiery eyes of Jesus Christ on the bema seat in heaven and me. There's my life. And the things that are consumed by fire were wood, hay, and stubble. And only those things that survive become the gold of the crowns I can cast at my Savior's feet. The bema seat is the judgment seat of Christ, a place where believers, only believers, will have their performance, not their sin judged. Their sin was judged at Calvary. Their performance will be judged at a bema seat. And this is the picture from which Paul would take that imagery for every Corinthian. Remember that Paul writes probably 3 letters here. 2 that we have in the New Testament, 1 that we perhaps do not have. That first letter, follow me very quickly, it's only going to take a minute. Chapters 1 through 6, 1 Corinthians. Stuff I know about your divisions and your terrible testimony because the household of Chloe squealed on you. Love and kisses, Paul. Right?
1 Corinthians what?
1 Corinthians 1 through 6. And in chapter 5, there's even sexual immorality that they're putting up with, and he says, you got to end that. In chapter 6, people are dragging each other to public courts, and he says, you got to knock it off. And then in chapter 7 through 16, it's, you wrote to me questions, I'm writing to you answers. Whether it's marriage, divorce, remarriage in 7, in 8, 9, and 10, meat offered to idols, or 12 through 14, and the gifts of the Spirit as they're operating inside the church, or in 15, the earliest message of the resurrection in clear theological terms, or in 16, offerings. Later on, he'll write back to the Corinthians because, frankly, they're the sassiest group of any in the churches. Oh, he's a big guy when he writes letters, but then he comes in here, he's all quiet because they remember when he came in, he didn't come in boldness. Why? He was beat up. So he writes 2 Corinthians about 3 things, remember? The first 7 chapters, an explanation why I promised to come back and didn't. In chapters 8 and 9, the expectation you'll finish up this offering you started taking and send it to the poor in Jerusalem. And then in 10 through the end of the book, an exhortation, would you please listen to your leaders? Why? Because tour groups from Corinth never got in the bus on time. They didn't listen. Okay? Those 2 letters, powerful letters, polemic letters to teach us, are embedded in this place. It's interesting to me that he mentions a bema seat, and it's interesting to me that there is such a dynamic renewal. Let me finish this by saying that there are 3 things that God has to give you to renew your passion. The first one is healing time. You know what? I buried an associate pastor and preached the next day. I buried my good friend and got up and preached 3 services the next day, and I was wrong. You must heal. If you don't take time for grief, it will not go away, it will roll back. And you can be fine and then pick up a spoon and start crying because it reminds you of something. Time. And one of the things the modern church doesn't do is give us time. Because there's another big meeting and we got to be ready. Greg, I don't care what you're going through. It's Sunday and you got announcements and you get up there and jazz it. What that does is creates a vacuum in the heart that can easily create masks of Hippocrates. It can create for us faces we put on. Rather than a family that we can lock arms with when we hurt, we can become sort of galvanized faces. The second thing God gave him, special friends. By the way, a little bit later, the rest of his team comes back while he's at Corinth. And he'll even hear from Timothy that the Thessalonians are doing great, and he'll send them back with a letter. The special friends, guys, if you don't have in your life people that you can lock arms with at the time when you are most down, I'm going to tell you something. The church is not designed to teach you to make friends. We're going to have to work harder because the next generation coming up doesn't seem to have that ability. And I would warn you, you are not called to walk the Christian life alone. You can't do it without the body. The third one, safe places. Safe places. God gave him through revelation a safe place. Stay here and I will be with you. The most important thing that Jesus can offer us is the best thing that he has to offer us, and that's himself. And so by being with us, that's what he said to Moses. You got nothing but a stick and you're walking through a desert, but I'm there. Oh, by the way, give me the stick. Give me what you have, because that's what I'll use. Right here in downtown Corinth, just remember, this was a low point, but you know what's great? I believe that the reason that he grew his hair, I believe that the vow that he took before God, because in Judaism you can take any number of vows, but they have to be direct between you and God, and your mouth is sealed as to your vow. That's why I can't tell you what it was, because he didn't tell anybody else. I believe that when he went Cenchrea, not far away from here, Cenchrea, he actually got there and cut his hair because he finished the year and a half and said, I trusted you. By the way, that's just about the time there was a new proconsul. So he kept up on the elections and said, oh, things are going to change, went, cut his hair and left. But I want you to remember this. He grew that hair as a physical sign of what Jesus promised him. You promised me you'll stay with me, I'll keep the hair growing, and at the end of the time, I'll cut my hair and I'll leave. And that whole time, I want you to remember, if you were a Corinthian, Paul didn't look all hot and cool and, he didn't look like he was some big powerful man. He looked beat up when he came. He limped through the first part, and then Jesus got a hold of him and he was renewed, but they knew him from before and after the renewal. And that's why they were sassy. If they would have only seen the Paul that strutted, they might have thought, wow, Paul. But instead, he came in hurt. Sometimes our vulnerability, we hide because we're afraid it will kill our leadership. The truth is, Paul exposed his vulnerability in 1st and 2nd Corinthians in order to endorse his leadership. This isn't about me, and it never was. Okay? Renewal of passion. Does that help? Okay.
Like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul.
Lord, I'm so glad we got a chance to be under this tree, sitting in the middle of ancient Corinth. I'm glad that Vicki was able to expose to us this ancient gathering place for people. But most of all, I'm glad that your word from long ago still touches those of us who get tired. We get beat up. We get to the place where we just don't know how to go on. And I'm thankful that you give us resting places and close friends and safe places. And I am so thankful that you give us your word. And that we can go back and learn that word and embed it in our hearts, and it can become our strength when we're weak. Thank you that in my weakness you are made strong. That is the promise that you've given us, that I don't have to pull off this Christian life by myself, because I am not suited to do it. How much I thank you for your love, your grace, and Father, for your word, and for your spirit, and in this moment, for the body of Christ surrounding me. Because there are times when I just need a brother to walk up and say, Randy, your attitude is off. Your heart doesn't sound like it's ringing right. I need those people. We all need those people. And so we come to you thanking you that you didn't just make us individually saved, you put us in the body of Christ. And that was taught to the Corinthians. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, thanks for joining us, looking at Corinth and the Corinthian Canal. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm asking you to come back next time as we continue to explore the lands of the Bible.